Welcome, everyone. And we have John Bevan, who is going to summarize the chapter for us. I have to say, this chapter infuriated me. In fact, this whole book infuriated me, but for obvious reasons. And I look forward to John's presentation.
Okay, should we get going?
Yeah. So I'm passing over to John Bevan, the Oslo Mythologies. Over to you, John.
Great. So the chapter I'm summarizing is chapter 8, the Oslo Mythologies. Hopefully everyone's somewhat familiar with what the Oslo Accords are, but I will give a brief summary as well. So I pulled this quote out, and this is something I've heard a lot in the last 8-9 months. They never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity for peace. It's like a nice Hasbara talking point, but it was attributed to Avigail, who was one of the senior members of the Israeli government, and kind of like goes along with the narrative that is always put on the Palestinians. So the reason that Israel was willing to participate in the Oslo Accords, the Labour Party won over the Likud Party in 1992 and pursued direct negotiations with the PLO based in Tunis. It was as a result after the first Gulf War, George Bush Sr. initiated the Madrid peace process, and neither party, either the PLO or the Israeli government, was very happy with what was happening there. So they kind of circumvented that process and set up their own with the support of the United States, obviously. So they contracted FAFO, which is a Norwegian peace institute. The two met in the open in August 1993 with American involvement, and the DOP, or Declaration of Principles, was signed in 93 on the White House lawn to much fanfare and hullabaloo. In general, the agreement was that Israel eventually would address the concerns around Jerusalem, the refugees, and the settlements that are continued to be expanded after the 5-year interim period, where Palestinians would demonstrate effective suppression of guerrilla terrorist attacks, its armies, attacks against the state, its armies, settlers, and citizens. And following this period, the second stage would begin, and that's when Israel would ostensibly fulfill their obligations under the Accords. So Dr. Pappé identified 2 myths about this process. Number 1 is that it was a genuine peace process. And number 2, that Yasser Arafat intentionally undermined it by instigating the Second Intifada. And for those of you who know the chapter well, I didn't maintain that kind of break. I just tried to summarize the main points that he identified. So in 1995, Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated, and the Likud party returned to power in 96. And Netanyahu overtly objected to the Oslo Accords, stalling negotiations. In 99, under Ehud Barak, the Labour Party returned to power, and the Camp David summit happened in the summer of 2000. And Dr. Pappé says to see the Palestine papers, which are publicly accessible, if you want a full account of the Camp David process, which I didn't have a chance to look at. So the Oslo process was not a fair and equal pursuit of peace, but a compromise agreed to by a defeated colonized people. That was kind of Ilan Pappé's summary of it, based largely on the partition, or the two-state solution, which kind of became very in vogue. There's a bit of a summary here on the left-hand side of the history of the two-state solution, but just to say that it's not something that really any occupied colonized people would ever agree to. But the Palestinians were willing to give up large concessions in order to achieve peace. At Camp David in 2000, Arafat, this was after a series of stallings and obfuscations by Israel, was seeking to end the colonization of the West Bank and end the brutalization of daily life. And that is restricted movement, collective punishment, arrest without trial, and humiliation at checkpoints. And obviously those things still exist to this day. The Rabin government forced this. Okay, so after the initial Oslo Accord, The Rabin government forced the partition of the West Bank into areas A, B, and C. Area C was under the direct control of Israel and constituted half of the West Bank. Movement between the areas was nearly impossible, and it cut off Gaza from the West Bank as well. And then Gaza was also divided into Palestinian and Jewish settler, between Palestinians and Jewish settlers. And the Jewish settlers controlled most of the water resources and lived in communities. The Accord's vague principles had already been translated into new geopolitical reality on the ground under the terms of what was called the Oslo II or Taba IV or Taba Agreement. So again, that's the partition of the West Bank and Gaza into Palestinian Jewish zones, and further partition of the Palestinian zones into small cantons or Batustans. The process did not involve military withdrawal from the occupied territories, did not promise the creation of a state, and after this was exposed closer to 2000 at the Camp David Accords, the negotiations halted and led to the Second Intifada. Crucially, under the Oslo Accords and at Camp David, the right of return was excluded deliberately. The refugees and Palestinians living inside of Israel's borders were not addressed. Despite the May Protocol from 1949, the unconditional refugees to be able to return to their homes or be given compensation, that's obviously never occurred. And effectively, after the 1967 war, the right of return, the focus of the right of return was able to be shifted to the refugees, the 300,000 refugees from the 1967 war, instead of the right of return from those expelled during the Nakba. And so Israel used or instigated the frame that the right of return was a provocation and a barrier to peace. And Camp David explicitly included the absolute rejection of the right of return of refugees. A little bit of a summary here. Between 96 and 99, settlement expansion continued unfettered in the West Bank and Gaza. And collective punishment against Palestinians continued. The Second Intifada started in September 2000 after Ariel Sharon toured the Haram al-Shifa.
It's actually Sharif, Haram el-Sharif. It's okay.
Okay,
it's Al-Aqsa Mosque.
Yeah, the Al-Aqsa Mosque was after with a large security and media presence. And then the nonviolent demonstrations were met with brutal Israeli suppression, which led to suicide bombings for those who felt that they needed to escalate. And also, Dr. Pappé said that Israel was seeking to reassert its veneer of military superiority, similar to its reaction to the recent Hamas incursion into their territory. To maintain its veneer of military superiority after being defeated by Hezbollah. And the Second Intifada ended with Operation Defensive Shield in 2002 and the building of the apartheid wall. And also he talks a bit about in the chapter of this idea that there's no one to negotiate with, which is another kind of Hasbara talking point, often repeated. It's because Israel consistently assassinates the moderate Palestinian leaders. And the example he gave was Ghassan Kanafani in 1972. I think I didn't write the date down, but yeah. So his conclusion here is that the whole Oslo process was at best a military redeployment and rearrangement of Israel's control in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And at worst, it was a new system of control that made life for Palestinians worse than it was before. And resistance to the process is a natural response to diplomatic charade that solidified and deepened Israel's control over the occupied territories. So that is my quick.
Quick and thorough.
Yeah, I wanted to leave room for discussion because there's so many parallels with. Sorry, I'm trying to stop sharing here. It's not.
I can stop you from sharing by using my dictatorial powers.
Yes, dictate.
Is there something you want to add, Johnathan, that you were thinking about as you were speaking after writing the presentation?
Oh, here we go. Not especially. Like it's just, yeah, I don't know. You had kind of articulated when I jumped on, Abigail, that it's just so frustrating to see this deliberate and ongoing blocking of any rights or dignity for the Palestinian people, and the complicity of governments and media in that is, I don't know, it's just really disheartening.
If you, I'd like to offer a point for everybody, and maybe we can start from that. Thank you, John. That was a brilliant presentation, actually. Helps everybody kind of focus and on the main point. Is there a possibility in a settler colonial project for there to be a fair and balanced negotiation for anything? It's so important that all of us are very careful about the language we use. So to counter denial, we continue to mention the term settler colonialism, which is very, very loudly absent from, for example, UK media, mainstream media. I don't know about other countries, but definitely, Mrs. O, we really need to watch what we say and use the right terminology. I don't talk about negotiations. I don't talk about peace. I don't talk about conflict. I talk about settler colonialism and everything that goes with it, genocide. We need to insist on using our own language. One of the ways that words get into society is by people starting to use them. It's by using them, not falling into the trap of the language trap that Israel has set up for us, along with whole other colonialist countries and all that have been before it. So I encourage you all to talk about settler colonialism. Ask your teachers, the ones who teach history, take them aside and say, can you teach about the history of settler colonialism in history? If you ask them to teach, people might be able to see. Thank you so much, everybody. You can put your sound up and wave goodbye and say goodbye to people. Bye.